Alright, so I don't typically do more than one franchise close together for obvious reasons, because it's just kind of a daunting task in general, but I figured why not go all in. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was the Hammer Dracula series, which there are 9 of. I think there's a couple of unofficial ones, but the 9 that are listed are going to be the ones that we go through, and I figure we'll just kind of take them one at a time and see where we end up. So, and 4 of them are represented in this DVD. I really need to get the rest of them in time, so hopefully I will eventually. But I do want to start with Horror of Dracula, obviously, which puts us in 1958, and obviously it's called Horror of Dracula, I think, in the US, while typically everywhere else it's just known as Dracula, but it does help to kind of differentiate it from the other Dracula titles, and we'll run into that a few times where the U.S. and the U.K. and whatever titles might be different, which is only slightly confusing. But talking about the first movie in general, where it's more of the kind of the story we recognize, where Jonathan Harker goes out and then meets him, and then all hell breaks loose in one way or another. Until Van Helsing comes in to hopefully save the day. But as far as Hammer Productions go, kind of in, like, even, not just the Dracula movies, but just kind of in general, what I really love about them, and I was discussing this with a friend over October when we were talking about Hands of the Ripper, and it's like, not only is it just this incredible aesthetic that just gives you this classic horror vibe that's been unmatched, even up to this point, is that a Hammer production is also like instantly identifiable, even if you're just looking at like one picture or like one still from one of those movies. And as far as like that having value in the horror world, where after a while things kind of start to blend together a little bit, particularly when you're working in one particular area, whether it be a certain monster or whatever, or Dracula in this instance. And just kind of immediately, it's one of those cases where whenever you see Christopher Lee in this movie, because it's one of those cases where he's used sparingly to the point that you don't even really realize it, because he makes such an impression that I think it's like 7 minutes of screen time or something, and the movie's like 80-something minutes. And I think he's got like maybe 16 lines of dialogue or something. It's one of those things, and you never notice it. It's sort of like Darth Vader in the first Star Wars movie. It's like when you hear how long he's actually there, it's like you can't even wrap your head around it, because the impression is there so in such a big way, and like every single time he's on screen you feel like you're watching like when you watch other movies down the line that emulate these movies, it's like you can tell when you're watching something that emulates something, and something that feels like the true original something, even though there's so many Dracula adaptations, a few of which we've talked about on here, like the Todd Browning's Bela Lugosi version, and all the ones that came after that. Like the whole Bela Lugosi version spawned a whole other thing, and then there's that Spanish version that was like shot at the same time. And there's just Dracula everywhere, but there's something about Lee's portrayal that feels like it kind of stands above everything, and when you hear the name Dracula, I think more often than not, people's first image of that, if not Bela Lugosi, will be Lee. Almost certainly. Really, it's just a question of if people see Lee more than they see Lugosi, depending on who you're talking to. But just immediately, as soon as he's introduced, when we have that, like, he has that very imposing entrance where he starts from the distance, and then he comes down the steps, and the camera pushes in like right on his face. And it's like so confronting when we first see him, and it's immediately there where it's like he's got that air of sophistication and like stoicism, but then in like one of the very next scenes, he like bursts into the room, and he's got the fangs and like the blood and all that, and it's both of those angles of the character are perfectly portrayed, especially the stuff we don't get very often, like the more sophisticated angle to him, where he's actually speaking. But both of them, I feel like, are equally effective and are equally great representations of the character itself. And talking about how easily identifiable a Hammer production is, This is going to get really redundant throughout this video, because it's going to be for every movie. Almost every movie. The production design is like out of this world. And it's always going to be, and not just the Dracula series, but any Hammer production. And that's one of the things I think really is what makes them stand out so much and makes them so identifiable. Especially when we get, like, our first glimpse of the castle, and we've got Harker's narration kind of walking us through it, but it's the way he basically describes it as exactly as we're processing it in the same way. When it's he talks about how, like, it looks, you know, rather innocuous in the light, but the fact that there's no birds singing, and it's like that still, even if it looks innocuous, there's still something completely sinister about it. But it's only slightly more inviting in the light than it is in the dark. And you can really say this about, and there's also the use of, like, constant fog looming. But there's also, you can also equate this to everything big and small as far as the production design goes. Like, there's always going to be the classic horror moment where you have, like the pub, where there's all the townspeople that kind of know what's going on and are kind of serving as a warning. Warning that's almost never actually taken. Stuff that you can see emulated in stuff like American Werewolf in London or something. And then as we go on and we get a vibe of what exactly it is that Harker's doing here, because he's initially got, like, kind of a cryptic purpose here. But then there's that really great reveal where he's writing in his diary, and he talks about how he's here to forever end Dracula's reign of terror. And we realize that this is a confrontation we've been building to, despite the fact that it has seemed so cordial up to this point. And then after this, after the confrontation with Harker that does not go in Harker's favor, we've already been cleverly introduced to Lucy through a picture, and we've seen Dracula's kind of immediate attachment to her. And what I really love about this is it pretty much sets up, now that Harker has been taken care of, Lucy is going to be next, the next thing that he goes after. And so I love the fact, especially the way that it's revealed, that we're introduced to Lucy, and everything seems relatively normal, and then it's only revealed at the end of this scene that he's already gotten to her by the time we see her. And that kind of gives Dracula almost this sort of unstoppable vibe, like he's going to always be, like, a step or two ahead of where we are. And it makes him more threatening even when he's off screen. And that's kind of, and I think that's also the power of where you would think Lee's screen time is longer than it actually is, because the movie works to make him imposing even when he's not physically there, by doing stuff like that and doing reveals like that. And it's great. So, and there's also stuff thrown in, like the just sort of surreal imagery that kind of comes in and out. Stuff like the first example that comes to mind is the idea of this, because usually when you think of, like, a hearse that's got a coffin in it, you kind of imagine it moving, like, really kind of slow, which, if we saw this in the night, would be incredibly creepy. But there's almost something weirder about it. Just the weird contrast of the image and what you would expect from it typically, of seeing this carriage that has this coffin in the back, and it is speeding into the night. And it's like to take what would already be creepy and amp it up in a way that the creepiness almost just turns straight up into surreal, is another, like, main quality to this kind of thing. And obviously, you know, throughout it we're going to get some eccentric characters here and there, like the Undertaker, with his little anecdotes about the guy that, you know, came to see a body and then fell to his death, and says something like he came to pay his respects and then just remained here. And then there's that little thing where he's, like, drumming on the coffin while he's trying to think of something. And that's the thing too, and this is something that kind of is in this movie that we don't really see in the later ones, which is this sort of sense of humor about itself, and not even a dark sense of humor, but just these comedic beats, like the whole thing that seems like, you know, right out of a slapstick comedy where the barrier gets broken not once but twice, and stuff like that. Really, you would think it would stand out in a not so great way, and it would be tonally off. But there's something about the camp factor to these movies where it just feels like it kind of belongs. Especially that it happens late enough that it feels like kind of a tension breaker, because this is obviously when Dracula's really running rampant. And so it's put in when you like kind of least expect it, which almost makes it funnier. And like I said, almost kind of adds that surreal quality to it because it's so unexpected, especially when the tension is starting to heighten at this point. And obviously, even when Lee is not working with dialogue, when he has that way of like sort of creeping forward in this really intimidating way. And like I said, every time you see him, you feel like you're watching something iconic. Even in like the lesser entries, just seeing Lee in the cape with the fangs just feels like you're witnessing history, and regardless of which of these long list of movies it is. But obviously, this would not be complete without the other side of Lee's Dracula, which is Peter Cushing's Van Helsing. Peter Cushing's very badass portrayal of Van Helsing when he's... what's really great about watching Cushing in this series, the little bit that he's here, is his commitment to the character. Because we learn a lot later that he had, like, say in some of the writing, and he was really adamant about the character doing certain things and not doing certain things, depending on how he felt the character would do it. Because it's usually like when you hear about Lee, like, Lee almost kind of seemed to... I mean, he got a certain enjoyment out of it, but there was also the case where he was always saying, like, the scripts were always shit, and they were never quite sure if he was going to come back for the next movie or not. And you kind of get the total opposite vibe of Cushing in the way... I mean, to Lee's credit, Cushing didn't have to be in as many of these. But you get stuff like him committing to his own stunts, like jumping over the banister and stuff like that. I believe it was his call to... We have the final confrontation, and obviously you want Dracula to go out in this big way, even if you're just, you know, doing the whole sunlight death, which would seem a bit anticlimactic, until you get the moment when he runs across the table in order to do so. Makes it much more, like, dramatic and sort of actiony in this way that really serves the climax. And apparently it was also Cushing's suggestion to do the candlestick crucifix, which is something what we see often even now, the whole doing like makeshift crucifixes and all. I don't know if that's the first example of that specifically, but certainly in this particular series. And yeah, just the whole thing though, like this whole first movie, you could just get a sense that it's like this sort of turning point for horror itself, like the sort of gruesome nature of it that we didn't really see come before it. I think the use of fangs, I want to say, this was like a really early inclusion into that, if not the first, and it might be the first, but it was really just something that like many of the moviegoers of this era just completely weren't prepared for, and how it was like really going forward with it and almost kind of confronting its audience with what it was willing to show. And add that on top of the fact that you just can't really beat this sort of 50s aesthetic that comes with this, and you certainly can't beat the, you know, Hammer production quality and costumes and cinematography and all that stuff. It just feels like this, in this particular first one in particular, it feels like every, like I talked about Lee, but I feel like every image in this, or nearly every image in this, feels iconic in a way that you can kind of see horror coming into this new way, like I said, will be still emulated forever through other movies and newer movies, so that's, I cannot think highly enough of this particular version. As far as, like, adaptations of the story itself, even if it's not, you know, like, there's a lot of them where you can't exactly rely on them to be completely accurate to the source material or anything like that. But as far as like the basic story goes in those adaptations, I want to say this might be my favorite one. Obviously, Todd Browning's is like right there. But there's just something about it, seeing it like... Because I've heard criticisms that some people think some of these Hammer Dracula movies would look better in black and white. But I feel like that's kind of what makes them different in their own identifiable thing, is the way they kind of burst with that color the way they do. Like I was talking about, like that 50s aesthetic that it has. And the fact that even when it was going into the 60s and 70s, the 50s aesthetic still kind of stayed. Which is amazing. So that's, like I said, it's hard to say something about this first one that hasn't been said already, but that's just my feelings on it. And like I said, probably one of my favorite adaptations of the story, just in general, so... Yeah, so that takes us into the Brides of Dracula, where we don't have... Not only do we not have Lee playing Dracula, we don't have Dracula at all, which seems like kind of a possible, we're not sure how this is going to go kind of thing, and it's like, can Van Helsing carry the movie by himself? Which, you know, after we saw him in the first movie, that really shouldn't have been a mystery. Of course, Peter Cushing's Van Helsing can carry his own movie, and this one does prove that. And I think it also helps that Terence Fisher, who was the director of the first one, comes back for this one as well. And this one does sort of try to amp up the creep factor in a sense, where we have this, once again, all this imagery that feels like it'd be emulated later, where we have the seemingly helpless woman in the carriage by herself, going through the woods, and there's a detour, and there's a stop, and there's a dude that's stalking around in the woods, that ultimately hitches a ride with them. And just immediately, this movie has such a barrage of sinister characters. It just like feels like every other scene in this movie introduces a new sinister character, which is great. It would seem like that would like almost overstuff it or something, but I kind of love that. I feel like because it feels like the danger is like constant, and you're never quite sure which of these characters, like to the extent that their sinister qualities or that their evil goes. So, and to start off with this dude that hitches a ride with him, we do have this moment in The Running Boar, when once she's there, we kind of get a sense that something might be off, and there's something about the whole feel of it, to where it's like everybody knows something that she doesn't, and then we get that moment where the talking and the music just stop, and that dude is just standing in the doorway, and it's like incredibly startling. In this really great way. And then, of course, it's in this scene that we are introduced to the Baroness, and the Baroness introduction does feel very similar to the first time we saw Lee in the first movie, when we kind of get that same sort of dramatic push-in onto her face, which sort of gives us the vibe that she's going to be the main antagonist of this story, so we think. But this movie has quite a bit up its sleeve to make it the obvious, maybe not so obvious. Because then eventually we get to the point where she takes her back to the castle, and then we are introduced to another character from a distance, that being the Baron. And just immediately when we see him, what's interesting is the fact that it's sort of it's a surprise and a little bit that the Baron is like our main antagonist, but it's already kind of creepy when we see him, even if he's introduced at first as a non-threatening character, because we basically are told by the Baroness that she lives alone. Like, there's nobody else here. There might be a servant or something, but otherwise there's nobody here. Like maybe Greta, and then that's it. And so when she looks outside and down and sees the Baron just sort of pacing on the balcony, it's almost ghost-like, where it's like, you know that there's not supposed to be anybody else here, but there's somebody here that looks awfully at home. That has like ghost written all over it. So that immediately gives it like this really sort of classic, almost like haunted vibe to it. Until we realize that the Baron is, well, we can't say a living person exactly, but a physical being that is here, and not a ghost. And then we get this very like almost Twilight Zone-like reveal of the person that seemed to be captive the whole time was captive for a good reason. And then, and obviously we've got David Peel playing him, and who is very good. It is interesting to me. I looked him up because he didn't seem that familiar to me, and it's like, apparently shortly after this, he retired and became like a really successful art dealer. So that's where he went. But he does play a very convincing antagonist here. Like I said, there's so many sinister characters, and I think the one that even stands out, even more so than the Baron himself, would have to be Greta, wouldn't it? With that laugh is haunting. It's like right up there with the Predator's laugh from Predator, as far as the laughs that you don't want to hear in the dark. She is absolutely up there, and she has what is probably one of the most haunting scenes, not just in this movie, but in the entire series. Like, in all 9 movies we're going to talk about. I feel like this is one of the scenes that probably haunts me the most, when we have the girl that has recently died, in the obvious way, and Greta is in the dirt and coaxing her out of the grave, and it's honestly terrifying. And that terrifying nature may possibly be a little bit extinguished by the look of this very fake bat. But there's a couple of things here. Number one, apparently the bat, there was actually a really good, like, effective fake bat that they had, but it was lost, and they had to replace it at the last minute, and that's why the bat looks so fake and cheesy. But at the same time, that is a case where, like when you watch old 50s sci-fi movies, don't you kind of, if you go in it for, like, the classic feel and, like, the campy feel, if you watch an old sci-fi movie, don't you want to see, like, flying saucers where the strings are visible? Doesn't that just give you, like, that really, like that campy vibe that you strive for when you see this? And like I said, stuff that's been emulated down the line. I feel like it's the same way with vampire movies and fake bats. It's like, that's kind of the charm of them, isn't it? So I actually feel like that kind of worked out in its favor a little bit. But I would be interested in knowing what the actual good bat that they had actually looked like. But going into that, we do have the return of Van Helsing once, obviously, things are out of hand here. And he's been, like, it almost feels like we're so used to him at this point after the first movie, that it's so, like, we immediately have this comfortable vibe that, oh, everything's going to get taken care of now that he's here, now that we've seen how badass he actually is. And it actually gets to that point when he shows up and he's kind of getting warnings, and then somebody just tries to brush it off by saying, oh, we try not to humor the local superstitions and stuff like that. And to think that somebody's telling Van Helsing this when we know the shit that Van Helsing has seen, is just very funny. And just to see how in the dark everybody is, when they kind of brush off Van Helsing like he has no idea what's actually happening here, or the fact that it can't be dealt with. And it's like we have this sort of instant confidence in him, and it's like as soon as he, like, whips out a cross, then we just know that it's like everything is going to be taken care of, and this is going to be great. Yeah, he does, like, immediately get knocked down the first confrontation, but he immediately gets back up, so we're good. And then he even gets some great scenes, like, that we didn't quite get glimpses of in the first movie, where, like when the Baroness has to be staked, and it's clearly a mercy killing, and it's like to see, like, the humanity in him when he has to do this, like the very humane way that he takes care of this, it kind of adds, like, a whole new layer to his character that we can take with us as we go into the climax. And of course, before we get into the climax, it's worth saying again, yes, the production design is amazing once again, because it's a Hammer production, of course, and the 50s aesthetic, all that stuff. And I do have a problem with the climax. It does feel very abrupt. Like, extremely abrupt. But there is one or two reasons for that. One of the things that I thought was kind of just alright was the idea of the panic, because I talked about that confidence that we have in Van Helsing after the first movie, and then what we've seen in this one. And then there's the big moment in the climax when he actually gets bitten. Something we think we're not going to see, ever. And how quickly this is dealt with. Where it's like, yeah, we'll just burn it, and we'll throw, some holy water on it, and it's fine. That's it. That's all it takes. It's like all the lives that could have been saved throughout this entire series if everybody in the movies knew how easy that was, apparently. But but the main thing here is how quickly the confrontation with the Baron goes, and how quickly it ends. And that's, obviously a staple of the series, of just kill the antagonist, credits roll, just immediately. But here, it does feel like he's dispatched a little easily, and we have Peter Cushing to thank for that, but not necessarily in a bad way. Because apparently the original ending was they were going to perform a ritual that had bats, like, break out of hell and destroy all the vampires. And when you hear that, especially in this era, you would think the problem with that would be, like, budgetary reasons. It's like, there's no way we can afford to do something like that. It would be so effects heavy, there'd be so much going on, and it would just be too much. But no, apparently the reason they didn't do it was that Cushing was committed to the character and said, "There's Van Helsing wouldn't use black magic. Like, that just wouldn't happen. He wouldn't resort to that." And so we get our more simple ending, and so it's like it kind of helps kind of digest the very simple and abrupt ending when you take into account that Van Helsing didn't do something that would be out of the realm of his character in order to finish this. The fact that he did it in a way that doesn't break character kind of you get more of an admiration for it, and not just the ending itself, but for Cushing's commitment to this. So yeah, and that's pretty much what the Brides of Dracula is. So we get really attached to the commitment from Cushing's performance and how he feels about the character and the character's decisions and his takes on them and his input and all that. And so it's like, great, now that we're used to this, let's not have him in another movie for a while, apparently. So, the thing here, though, is that we saw the two of them together in the first movie, and then we saw Cushing's Van Helsing get kind of a solo movie for himself. So now we're going to get Lee kind of having a solo movie, that being without Van Helsing. So Terence Fisher is back once again, which is great, and we do get a recap of the climax of the first movie, which kind of leads us into this, which makes you think, oh, are we getting another confrontation? But no, once again, we are without Cushing and without Van Helsing. But what I actually really like about this one, and I can see it being something the movie's criticized for, but something that I really like about Prince of Darkness is it feels like a classic haunted house movie. Like I was talking about, where I kind of got that vibe when we're introduced to the Baron briefly. In Prince of Darkness, it feels like it's sort of it sort of goes on it being like this classic haunted house story, with Dracula not even coming to life until halfway through. So the entire first half is mainly just these characters in the castle. But before that, we do get those classic moments of if these characters are going to go into this place, naturally they have to be warned by somebody that they're not going to listen to. In this case, it is this very unorthodox monk, I think, from a monastery. And he's a guy who is very focused on doing things like heating his posterior by the fire, stuff like that. So in a way, we can kind of see, in his sort of unorthodox nature, why you might not take his warnings, but once again, we are in a horror movie, so we're going to get that moment when it's like, whatever you do, don't go to Carlsbad. Like, that's the last place you want to be. Like, do not, for any reason whatsoever, go there, because bad things will happen. And of course, they say, well, let's find out for ourselves. We don't believe this dude, let's just do it. And then as it goes on, like, all these different things happen to where, like, if anything, it feels so much like a haunted house movie rather than a vampire movie at the start, which is something that I like about it, because it's almost like the vampire element kind of sneaks up on you, because you get so involved in what's already going on here, and the elements of, like, the carriage takes them there without them necessarily wanting to go there. Then you've got the bags that are already unpacked and in the rooms. You've got the creepy sort of servant with clove, and dinner's already prepared, like it was, like the castle was always waiting for them. And there's just something already really creepy and sinister about that, and especially when you've got only one character that kind of feels like something's totally off here. Like, you got all the other characters just saying, like, oh, well, that's kind of weird, but alright. When Helen is the one that's kind of freaking out consistently. Like, she just at the sight of Clove, she's, like, losing her mind when he just walks into a room before he's even said anything. And, of course, you know, she's the only one that naturally feels the way that everybody else should. And it's the way they handle this also in regards to, like, the production quality and the way it's shot and stuff like that. We get the moment when Clove's putting the lights out in the hallway, and then the camera just sort of lingers there on the window and then just kind of turns, and we just kind of bask in the darkness. You just immediately get this feeling that something's, like, way off. And then naturally we kind of start losing our characters, where we have Alan, Helen's husband, and he's the one that gets to go and investigate the strange noise. Like I said, very classic haunted house movie, which is the appeal to me. And then it gets kind of unexpected in a way where Clove naturally attacks Alan while he is investigating a noise in the dark. But the thing is the way that, and once again, when we're still in the era, because like I said, this is the series that like sort of confronts you and showing more than you would expect it to in this era. So we get to that moment when Clove is behind Alan and seemingly hits him. Like you kind of expect that moment where it's somebody gets hit from behind and then they just, go unconscious or whatever. Until we realize how slowly Clove is pulling away from this strike, and we realize he didn't just hit him with something, he stabbed him. Which is a very unexpected moment, and shows that there is a real threat here. And then of course, this leads to Alan's blood hanging above, bringing Dracula back to life. Like I said, this is about 45 minutes in, we get the resurrection, and then it's kind of the movie we expect it to be when we have all the characters kind of converge all at once in this one place, except Alan, obviously. And then it's like Clove kind of creeping in the background. But then we end up losing Helen eventually in those moments before we kind of get away from the castle scenes, which is really interesting that we kind of take the focus on Diane and Charles, because they just we get so much focus on Alan and Helen, especially with Helen being the one that felt like everything was off. And it's like she's going to be the only one with her eyes open, which usually means that's kind of singling out an early protagonist. So it's very interesting when Helen ends up not being the protagonist and is off significantly early. And then Diane and Charles basically become our main protagonists throughout. And yeah, while that's a great shift, I do feel like it sort of, I got so attached to the haunted house thing that it does kind of, I feel like it loses some of its, like the magic it had going here, once they leave the castle. But we do still have some really great moments here that kind of build up the terror of it, whenever we see Ludwig by himself, and then it's like, it almost feels like the music is kind of like approaching, or like something is approaching, and stuff like that. And whenever we do get Lee come in as Dracula, what's really interesting about this is it felt like this was only a matter of time, especially when you look at throughout the series. The idea that Lee has no lines in this movie at all. Like, Dracula is a completely silent character apart from like growls and screams and stuff like that. And I do think that's actually really interesting, to have like this sort of, like an actor that's like this refined, and what he can do without words, and just playing it in like this really sort of monstrous and like animalistic way, especially when you think about like the sophistication he had at the start of the first movie and how so far away that sophistication seems. When you look at the character the way he is now, like, it feels distant in this way that's like kind of terrifying. And there's multiple things here about why Lee has no lines. Like, there's a whole thing where apparently he claimed that it's because the dialogue was shit and he didn't want to say it, so he just said, I'm going without lines. But apparently the screenwriter disputed this, so it's hard to tell. And the movie was a long time ago, so everybody's memory may not have been entirely there when they made these comments, so I don't know. But then of course we get to our inevitable climax where Dracula is going to be stopped in one way or another. In this case, it's water. He drowns. And it's like, usually you kind of think, oh, is this going to be the one where we kind of get closure? Is this like the grand finale? Which of course we know it never is. But this was still early in the series, so audiences may not quite have been sure if that was going to be the case, but we know now, because that's just the thing. That's the horror thing. You always kind of leave it open. And it's a case where, even when it seems like they really, truly finish him off in multiple movies later, it does genuinely look like that, even though he does eventually come back. This is a case of, oh, he drowned. Like, do you think you're going to stop his ass with water? It's like, yeah, there's definitely going to be another one of these. And despite that, this Prince of Darkness has always kind of been one of my favorite ones, because I just really like that. I mean, I know, like, we really want Lee to be here, we want Dracula to be here, and it's really great when he's here, especially to kind of see what he can do without dialogue. But it's really that first 45 minutes that really draws me in, where it just kind of feels like a regular classic horror movie. Like I said, I know that seems like it should be the opposite of appealing, but it's just done so well to me. And like I said, just seeing it through the Hammer aesthetic is just, that's always going to draw you in. So yeah, I feel like this one's kind of, I don't know if it's held in particularly high regard, especially compared to some of the ones around it, but it's always been one of my favorites. So that's pretty much where I stand on that. As far as the next one goes, Dracula Has Risen from the Grave, which could be a bit disappointing, and I wonder if it was disappointing at the time, for a number of reasons. Number one, it's not the big, campy thing that the poster suggests, the very famous poster, where it's that black and white image of a woman's neck, and despite the black and white, it's got pink, she has two pink band-aids, where a vampire bite would be, and it says Dracula's risen from the grave, and then the tagline is just obviously in parentheses. And it's like as soon as you see that poster, you immediately get the vibe that we're going into like self-aware territory. We're going into kind of a satire, and like this sort of ultimate camp vibe that you might expect. But no, it's really just the tone isn't really any different or any more self-aware than it has been up to this point. But another thing that might be kind of disappointing is, and maybe this is on a viewer that might look at it this way, but when you do the calculating of where we were in the franchise at this point, it's like we have Dracula and Van Helsing going against each other in the first movie. Then you break away, and Van Helsing gets a solo movie, and then Dracula gets a solo movie. So when a fourth movie comes around, what do you kind of expect might happen? Are we going to finally get that rematch? But no, we don't. Cushing's still not here. Van Helsing is still missing in action. And we get another one. But I do know, I've heard a couple of people say this one is one of their favorites in the franchise. And I can see where that's coming from. We do have a change in director, where apparently Terrence Fisher was supposed to do this one, but then he was in like a car accident like right beforehand, and had to be replaced by Freddie Francis, which is interesting because Freddie Francis, who not only he was an Oscar-winning cinematographer. He had his first Oscar already by this point, I believe, and then would go on to win for Glory many years later. But as far as being in this particular territory, which is significantly different from a lot of the movies he shot as a cinematographer, as far as a director goes, this is territory that he would be familiar with, having done the original Tales from the Crypt movie that I love so much. And he also did like Trog, so it's like he knows the territory well enough, and it seems like, especially with like that first Tales from the Crypt movie, it seems like it puts him in the perfect position to do one of these. So it's a case where obviously we're getting into the fourth movie now, and some people may be getting a little bit restless. Like it got to the point where I always think about when we get to the point towards the beginning when we realize that Dracula's here, and somebody says, when shall we be free of his evil? And it's like, I can just only imagine that's what the critics were thinking at the time, and I'm sure they were. But it is to my understanding it was somewhat like that, but over time the movie's been reevaluated and is now considered kind of a height in the franchise itself. And yes, as usual, we're getting that incredible Hammer production quality. I told you that was going to get really redundant, and it's going to continue. But what's really interesting about that is we get used to how that looks, and there's one shot here in particular when the priest is going up to exorcise the castle, and we get this shot from like kind of the distance where it's almost like we get to know what Hammer Productions look like, and these particular movies have looked like production design wise, and we get the sense that they're kind of set in this really same sort of confined world. And so we do get this one shot when they're like climbing up the mountain and they look out, and it's almost like the view that we get feels like it's an entirely different world, like it's an entirely different dimension that we never quite explore. And just getting a shot like that almost kind of feels like we're breaking out of this world that we're so familiar with already. So that's always kind of been fascinating to me, even if we don't quite explore that. It just kind of sets up the whole idea that this is set in like one confined area, like this whole franchise is. That I really like in this confined world, and it's almost like all of the terror that we see in these movies, like we're kind of trapped with it in a way in like a small location. Um, so, and obviously the aesthetic still has like kind of that 50s sort of look to it, despite the fact that we're going into like the 70s now. Like I think this came out in '69, and obviously we started in 1958. And it's like the way that aesthetic is able to carry over, even if movies didn't quite look as much like that as time went on. The fact that they kept that up, I think, is really the magic of what these movies just look like, which is a big part of their place in like horror movie history. And yeah, and it's not as much of a build up in regards to getting Dracula back into the story. I think it's maybe like 20 minutes in or something. We do get that first shot of him where he's like pointing, a very classic shot, but it's the same thing where it's like every time, like we talk about it being kind of late in the franchise and maybe people are getting a little restless, but at the same time there's some things that will just never get old, whether it be that 50s aesthetic or the first time we see Lee every time he's been resurrected. Like there's always that one shot that's like the defining he's back again moment. And that's something that I never get tired of seeing and never never wears out. And he's speaking again. Not very much, but once again, he never really did it in the first place, so yeah. Now, the thing about this one that I don't know if it's the reason I'm not as drawn to it as something like, say, Prince of Darkness or even the other two, is there's a lot of focus on this sort of love story that's going down, where we have the character of Paul, and who wants Maria. And Paul kind of gives me this vibe when we first meet him, where he's like, this is the weirdest kind of random comparison, but he kind of reminds me of a combination of Ambrose and Cornelius, the characters in Hello, Dolly. It's like he feels like kind of a combination of those characters without the music. And so we basically get him, meeting Maria's family, and he's tried to have fun in the pub, and he's accidentally dumped beer on himself, and it becomes this very meet the parents kind of moment. And that's, like, their love story is where a lot of it lies, but we do get some characters on the side that add some flair to this, like Xena. And the thing about Xena is actually probably one of the more tragic characters to me in the whole franchise, because we do get the first thing is that she gets rejected by Paul not once but twice, or not rejected by Paul, but rejected in favor of Maria. So when this has already happened the first time, when she's with Paul, and then Maria comes in and has to break everything up, and she's just kind of sent off into the woods by herself, rejected. And just as if that can't get any sadder, we get this very terrifying, nightmarish scene of her just walking along by herself, and she accidentally comes across the carriage that the priest has the reins of, and it seems like he's asleep or unconscious, we're not quite sure. And then there is that inevitable moment where, when you're having like a terrifying dream where like you see something, and then something sees you, and then that thing starts to pursue you, is just... It's the stuff that nightmares are made of, and that's the way this scene plays out. It's like when we see the carriage kind of... She sees it, and we know it's creepy, and she kind of starts to walk a little faster. And then when we see it creep out and turn slowly, knowing that it's coming for her, and that it has basically marked her, it's a terrifying scene. Like, I hate how terrifying it is, but I love it too. But then, of course, once she becomes like a disciple of Dracula, there is the thing when she gets rejected in favor of Maria again. Like, it's so sad to me when Dracula's pursuing Maria, and her response is, you don't need Maria, you have me. And it's like she's already been rejected once at this point. But That's the way. She's just a tragic, and when it actually comes that her character is actually killed off, I just think it's genuinely sad. And it's maybe that's just me, I don't know, but that's like one of the main takeaways as far as character goes in this movie that I have. Like, I'm much more fascinated with Xena than I am the whole Paul Maria relationship. But maybe that's just me, I don't know. But as far as the horror element goes, there is plenty of creep factor apart from that carriage scene. The priest in particular here, well, interestingly, playing a rather innocent character when he starts off, becomes one of the creepiest characters in the movie, especially when he's like kind of lurking in the shadows. And it's like it's always fun to see who like the Renfield is going to be, like who the animated sort of servant is going to be, the actor that gets to kind of chew the scenery more than anybody else usually. In movies like this, that says a lot. But there is still, like, there is the cheesy factor of, you know, the villainous people sort of hide in the shadows and stuff like that, but you get the sense of why that eventually became a cliche and something we saw a lot in lesser horror movies, and it's because it's still creepy. Like, it still has a certain scary element to it, the stuff like that we see here that might seem cheesy by today's standards or cliche by today's standards, only got that way because it really was terrifying at the time. And it still is when you watch it back, to a certain extent. But, yeah, overall, I do think this one is slower, especially with the focus it has. And you would think the focus on the character would be appreciated, but, like I said, it feels like we're getting less focus on the characters that draw you in much more. Though we have a really great climax, for sure, and probably one of the better Dracula deaths in it. And we do have the character of Mauler, who kind of feels like our protagonist in a way, even more so than Paul in certain instances. So the fact that he dies as early as he does, which isn't terribly early, but much earlier than, say, a protagonist would, it is kind of genuinely surprising in the moment that it comes, but then we're just left with, like, Paul and Maria, and it's... yeah. So I don't feel like it's one of the stronger entries as far as, like, our main characters go, like, our protagonists go. But it's definitely got some of the greater and more memorable moments in the franchise. But I feel like those are a bit fewer and far between than they are in some of the earlier entries to the series. So that's pretty much how I feel about that one. Now we'll move on to Taste the Blood of Dracula, where the director changes hands again, and now it's Peter Sasda, who is the director of Hands of the Ripper, which I mentioned at the very beginning of this video, so it all kind of comes back. And as we know, he will obviously have a good hand on that whole Hammer aesthetic anyway. So going into this, we actually have more recognizable faces in the cast than we usually do. Like, one of the main... not protagonists necessarily, but people we follow, is Jeffrey Keane, who was the Minister of Defense in a lot of the Bond movies. And surprisingly enough, Peter Sallis, yes, as in the Peter Sallis that plays Wallace in Wallace and Gromit, and also Roy Kinnear, who, aka Veruca Salt's dad, and a number of other people also. And this is a case where we immediately pick up where the other one left off, where when we're introduced to Roy Kinnear's character, who's like the first character we meet, he literally just walks right into the climax of the previous movie, and we start there. And that kind of continuity has also been something that's been really appealing throughout this franchise, how it literally just feels like it picks up right where the others left off and all that. It would be a real shame if this was they just kind of stopped doing that after this one, wouldn't you think? So, going into this, talking about the Jeffrey Keane character, William, where we see him and his family at church, and he's obviously that very sort of stuck-up type, and his daughter Alice makes the unfortunate mistake of locking eyes with somebody, some dude, forcing them to come home, and for him to scream at her that she is a harlot, and stuff like that. So, and he's all about his charitable work and stuff like that. So, naturally, he's church-going, he won't have his daughter looking at guys in any way whatsoever, and he's all about his charity work. Of course, this guy has some deep and dark secrets. And of course, he and his buddies hang out in brothels when they're supposedly doing their charity work. And just kind of doing an all-around sort of thrill-seeking thing. Until they meet a creepy-looking dude named Courtly. And this is the point where when we see inside this brothel, we get the idea that we're starting to get more into a kind of R-rated territory with these movies. Because we've already talked about before how they were already confronting for their time and showing more than you'd expect in their time. But now we're kind of... Now that we're getting into, like, the 70s, we can really start to get into that sort of full force. So we do... What's really interesting about that, though, is what I was talking about, how these movies kind of keep that sort of 50s aesthetic as well as they can. And to kind of see that meshing with the sort of R-rated nature of the 70s coming in is kind of this really interesting contrast when you look at it visually in regards to what you're actually looking at. Whether it be gore or nudity or anything of that like. But once they meet Courtly, of course, this is going to go in the direction we expect of eventually Dracula is going to be risen somehow. Likely through a ritual of sorts. And what's really great about this is the way all these movies don't necessarily just start with the resurrection of Dracula. Like, it's always, in most of these, it's kind of a process to get to that point. It often becomes a significant chunk of the movie itself in how Dracula comes back. And it's always interesting to see exactly how that's going to happen. It's like half the fun, seeing how that's going to happen. And, of course, that's kind of slightly told to us by the title is a big clue. But once that happens, and Courtly is changed, I guess we could say, by this ritual, the three of them, our three main people here, decide to beat him to death out of complete fear and kind of an impulse reaction, you might say. And then what's really interesting about that is it takes it into... This is basically kind of three different types of movie, in a way, in regards to breaking it up as not just in like the horror genre, but sometimes in kind of the thriller side of that, because we obviously have the horror movie here, we have the Dracula movie here, where through Courtly, Dracula is able to rise, and we get this really great moment visually when we see, like, it's Courtly's body laying there, and there's like the shadow of the flames that are there, or almost like kind of dancing on the ground, and it's sort of like seeing a soul come out of him, but also a soul go into him at the same time is kind of what it looks like. And we've got these like zoom-ins that happen to the rhythm of a heartbeat. And it's like this really intense, but also really theatrical and grand entrance to Dracula in this movie. So I always thought that was really well done. But then we go back to the other three guys, and it's basically one of those like in that those thrillers that you see where people have to contemplate whether they've gotten away with a murder or not. It kind of becomes that a little bit when it's the three of them discussing this. But then, of course, at the end of the day, it is also a revenge movie, where once Dracula is back, he is ready to take revenge on all three of them for killing his servant. And if you didn't know that, we are helpfully told by Dracula just blatantly saying his actions as he goes throughout this movie, where he just rises to an empty room and says, "I shall take revenge for the death of my servant," or whatever it was. And then when he kills one of them, he says, "The first." When he kills the second one of them, he says, "The second." These happen in close-ups on his eyes. And it's the whole movie is very exposition heavy. There was the opening scene when we're getting the idea of his supposed charity work, Williams, and he says, you know why I, don't engage in dinner on the last Sunday of the month or something. And she's like, "Oh, yes, of course, your charity work." And it's like, for some reason, there's a lot of that in this one that usually the others tended to avoid, at least, if not avoid entirely, at least not as blatantly as we see here. But once again, we're getting late into the series. Everybody's getting tired, including the writers, so this is what we have. And of course, they had to convince Lee to even be in this movie, because there's the whole thing where it might seem like Dracula's appearance is kind of tacked on, particularly with what I'm talking about, where it's like his job is to basically just say the first one is dead, the second one is dead, etc. And that's actually because, like, you would almost joke, I don't think Dracula was supposed to be in this movie. I think they kind of added him in at the last minute. When in actuality, that's kind of exactly what happened. Because apparently it was originally made to where it wasn't even going to be, like, it was set up to where it wasn't even going to be a Dracula movie at all. And it was going to be the story of Courtly doing the ritual, and then them beating Courtly to death, and then Courtly rises from death, and Courtly is the villain. And yeah, you can see that being its own movie in this just sort of area, and kind of being a non-Dracula entry in like the sort of the full Hammer franchise, franchises, if that's what you want to call it. But apparently it was the studio would not release the movie unless Dracula was in it, which is what they eventually used to get Lee to come back as briefly as possible, pretty much. But there's still stuff, I mean, even though you can kind of tell that was the process, there's still some things in this movie that are worthwhile, particularly some things that might really throw you off and where you can tell they're kind of trying to do new and interesting things, where we have one instance that is kind of an interesting turn, but actually goes in an even more interesting direction in how it's concluded, like the Peter Sallis character, where you wouldn't think Wallace would be a threat in any particular circumstance, but at least, you know, to anyone other than his own well-being. But here, he does have, his character in particular has a turn where his daughter Lucy gets involved in the mix, and once she is turned and it's aware that she's going to have to be killed and staked, he's going to try to stop that from happening. So he kind of, very, very briefly, becomes an antagonist or a threat in himself, where he's trying to prevent this thing that needs to be done, and he's willing to shoot his friends in order to make sure that happens. And it's like, that's kind of an interesting direction in itself. And if it had gone further, it would have been a bit more, you know, I guess obvious and predictable, I guess, as it went. But they kill this quite literally pretty quickly by having this interesting and sort of ironic scene when his character is killed by his daughter, and it's a human being staked through the heart by a vampire, which is, and I'm really thinking, I don't recall seeing that before, so when we're getting this late into the franchise and they can still throw inspired little bits like that in, it still feels like there's some life left in it, even if it's a small portion of the movie. If there's still kind of a sign of life, you do kind of want to see where it's going to go, and if there's anything else they can possibly do. And this movie tries to do that, even with, like I said, basically trying to kind of tacking Dracula on at the last minute. Which is also really interesting because this was one of 4 movies in 1 year, in 1970, when Christopher Lee played Dracula. Because there was this one, and then there was the one that's like, what is it? It's like part Italian, part German, part Spanish, where it was trying to be more of a retelling of the original story. It's the one where Klaus Kinski plays Renfield, which is one of the best casting choices ever. Kinski had his great Dracula portrayal in Nosferatu, which, Werner Herzog's Nosferatu is obviously probably my favorite Dracula portrayal, but I meant when I said before that the first one was my favorite adaptation, we're talking strictly about, like, I guess just the one's titled Dracula, even though he did play actual named Dracula in that, but that's beside the point. But on top of that one, he also had a cameo in a movie called One More Time, which was a Jerry Lewis-directed movie that had, like, Sammy Davis Jr. in it. But that was just like a cameo, to my understanding. So, of course, the 4th time he played Dracula in this same year, 1970, was the next movie, which is Scars of Dracula, which we're changing directors again. We're going on to Roy Ward Baker, who we've seen in this genre a number of times. Like, most notable to me is the anthology movie Asylum, but he also did The Vampire Lovers, which is much more in the realm of this. And to my understanding, the reason we completely abandoned the whole continuity thing and the picking up where the other movie left off thing that we were doing this whole time, when Scars of Dracula came around, was that this was supposed to be somewhat of a reboot, to my understanding, where they were going to kind of try to go back to the basics, and obviously, you know, Dracula's kind of back to the way we saw him initially, where he's back to speaking, and that sophistication that we saw, that we haven't seen since the first, when he was talking to Harker, is kind of where the character's back to. But the thing about it is that it still feels like more carries over. Like, we have, for the third movie in a row, we have a protagonist named Paul. And none of these are the same characters. But we also have an Alice. We have a protagonist named Paul, and we have a girl named Alice whose father is very angry with her at the start because he thinks she is oversexed. And I swear we are not talking about the taste of the blood of Dracula. But this one also has a servant named Clove, like we saw in Prince of Darkness, who also is obviously not technically the same character. So it's a different actor, it's a different portrayal, but yeah, so there's a whole lot of elements that we've seen before, even in just the last movie, that are coming over into this. But you can tell it's them kind of trying to kind of start fresh and go back to what we knew, and yeah, it doesn't feel as much of a retread as that might sound. It's really more in just the setup. But once it goes, it does kind of find ways to distinguish itself. Kind of starting with this opening shot, where, of course, we're going to start off with the really dark imagery of Dracula being resurrected by this blood-spewing bat. And all of it's very dark, the aesthetic's very dark and stuff like that. And then we get this jarring cut to this really bright day, like a really bright blue sky, and the grass is like really, really green. And it's like very picturesque in its way, but then it's immediately interrupted by the imagery of death once again, where when it seems like a total and complete contrast to the scene just before it with all the darkness, this eventually turns into... It kind of reminds me of the shot in the original Frankenstein when he's carrying his daughter that Frankenstein has accidentally drowned through the town. And like everybody's gathering, and it's a girl that has been bitten. So we see that not only has he been resurrected, but it's already started again, as the opening credits are happening. And of course this is going to give us more looks at the stellar fake bats that are flying around. There's a lot of the fake bats in this one. But like I said, the faker they look really is just like the charm of the era. Or what was once the era. Because like I said, we are in the 70s now, but we're still kind of keeping the 50s look to it, and the 50s sort of low-budget nature of it. And we have more of a... I can't help but notice that this one seems to have a very similar structure to Psycho, where it's... we have what appears to be an established protagonist in Paul, the third Paul. But where we get a whole setup where the Alice at the beginning is not the major character that the previous Alice was, and this isn't confusing at all. And she has accused him of rape just to get out of trouble with her father, so he is pursued by the cops and eventually finds his way to the castle. Once again, as usual, whether he meant to get there or not, there was going to be a carriage that made sure it got him there. Or at least in the path of Clove, who would get him there. So once he's there, we do get this sort of classic feeling all over again, where we meet a strange woman who may or may not be changed, but she's certainly a sort of disciple of Dracula's, and she's there to lure him. And we get like this really classic feel. It's the music that really contrasts the darkness of the background and the sinister nature of the background, where it's like it's like a harp sound that's kind of like luring him. And you can then just kind of luring us into danger in general. And then eventually we are switching up who our protagonists are. Because Paul has a brother, Simon. Paul Simon, that's easy to remember. And he has a fiancée, Sarah, and of course they're the ones coming to investigate, sort of like Marion Crane's sister and Loomis, in a way. Only they're the ones that are Lars, as opposed to his sibling and Laura coming in the way Psycho did, but it's basically here. There's a potential love interest going on regardless of the people that show up and the protagonists that are going to take the focus now. And while we get to that point, though, when Tanya is killed and Paul's fate is left up in the air until it's revealed what happened to him. We're getting much more of that R-rated nature we started heading towards in Taste of the Blood of Dracula, where we're seeing much more gore than we ever have up to this point. In a very startling way, we actually see Clove, like, you know, sawing up the body into chunks and throwing them into the tub, and then there's the acid that's going to dissolve it, and it's like, now we're really getting into like the really gruesome territory, and it's kind of the way we're going into a new decade kind of opens up more of what exactly they can do and not having to be held back. But there's still, I mean, obviously the censors are still going to be doing the best they can to hide some of this, and there's certain cuts of it from different countries that show more than others do, of course, which has been a running thing throughout the whole franchise. But we do get some more freaky imagery, not just associated with gore, because we talked about this a lot when we did the Saw franchise, where it's like, once you can depend on gore, is that all you're going to do to try to get the scares? But no, we still get stuff like, you know, Dracula scaling the wall, and memorable stuff like that. And like I said, just the overall sinister nature of the setting itself, and the castle, and the bats, and all that. Almost comically so, when it's like, these are characters that are like so oblivious to how clearly sinister this place is. But still, that's all part of the charm, is you can't have a horror movie without some really oblivious characters that are just walking right into their face without knowing it. Or at least into danger that they can ultimately get out of, because they're the protagonists. But that's the thing, is you can't always tell who the protagonist is, considering we lose Paul halfway through the movie, much like Marion Crane, so... but we also have some side stories going on here. Like, we have what is he, like a pub owner, and he's got his daughter, and they're kind of hiding the fact that Paul has been here when everybody comes looking for him, because they're basically trying to stop the carnage. And now it's almost like this whole conspiracy with the entire place. And then it's his relationship with his daughter becomes the whole thing until she's eventually taken, and it has like its own arc. But then there's also the thing where Clove has an attachment to Sarah, who he previously saw in a picture, and then that turns into him having to kind of go his own way, and then there's a confrontation, and it's a nice big climax where all this comes together, and there's a lot going on, but then it ultimately just leads to the typical thing of Dracula dying by accident. Where he's impaled, and it's like, well, that's not going to harm me too much until it is struck by lightning. And he is set ablaze, and the credits roll. So, and that won't be the last time that Dracula dies, purely by accident. It might even be the way the next movie starts. So to go on to Dracula A.D. 1972, we'll start off by saying that we've had another change in director in Alan Gibson, who has mostly had like a long array of TV credits, a very impressive array of credits for somebody that sadly didn't make it to age 50. But when it starts, we immediately go into what looks like it might be the continuation of something else, but it's the continuation of something that we haven't seen. Because I was talking about how you sort of wait for the Peter Cushing's Van Helsing, Lee's Dracula rematch after the first movie, and we've been denied and denied and denied up to this point. So now, when this movie starts, we're in the middle of an action scene that appears to be in the midst of an ongoing rivalry that we haven't really seen. So we're seeing like the end of a movie that could have been like the fourth movie in this franchise. Not to take away from any of the other movies in the franchise, but it just would have been nice to get much more of this rather than just being the opening scene of this movie, or the end of the first one. But obviously this eventually leads to the death of Van Helsing as we know him, and we have Dracula dying again by accident by being impaled on a wagon wheel after the crash. And it makes you wonder if that death is so embarrassing, if that's why Dracula spends the next 100 years with this disciple, planning his return, and then this is how he's going to take revenge. It's like just the embarrassment factor of getting impaled on a wagon wheel of all things when you're one of the biggest villains in movie history. But I don't know, getting struck by lightning may be just as embarrassing. I don't know, but you will notice that we're doing a 100-year jump here. The movie came out in 1972, so that's when the movie's going to be set, and we want exactly a 100-year time jump. So that means that this opening scene with the death of Van Helsing and them battling to the death for the last time, supposedly, is in 1872. Which is an issue because, to my understanding, the original movie is 1885. So what I'm understanding here, as far as what I've heard, is that this was basically meant to be, because Scars of Dracula was kind of, in a way, supposed to be a bit of a reboot. So now, this in itself is also a bit of its own reboot, starting its own new timeline that's going to go into the following movie, The Satanic Rites of Dracula. And so these two, this one and the next one, are kind of their own continuity and their own timeline, I guess. So, once again, doing everything they can to totally not be confusing. So they got as bad as the X-Men franchise eventually in regards to their continuity and trying to do timelines and reboots and all that stuff. But yes. So anyway, yes. Now we jump ahead to 1972 with this jarring cut to an empty sky to a plane as the title hits. It's their 2001 moment. So, what it appears to be, to my understanding, is that audiences were getting a bit tired, and audiences were kind of dwindling at the time, so it was like, okay, now we kind of need to shake things up. So I've been talking about the whole keeping the 50s aesthetic even once we reach the 70s. Well now, yes, the time has finally come to abandon that and start getting a bit more modern. Of course, by modern we mean 1972. So it's like, is this that rematch we've been waiting for? Because of course we're going to get a descendant of Van Helsing, so Peter Cushing is still in the movie as a Van Helsing, who also has a granddaughter, Jessica, who is also going to be a character that's prominent in both these two, even if the actress might change. So the disciple now, and I was never really quite able to figure out if Johnny Alucard is the disciple from 1872, or if it's another descendant thing. I'm assuming it's a descendant thing, but he's a character that's brought in, that we're introduced to in this scene, that's basically like kind of a 70s music video to show off that he's like a Hellraiser in general. He gives serious Alex DeLarge vibes throughout. Not just in his behavior, but he somewhat resembles the early 70s Malcolm McDowell. And of course his name Alucard, we're going back to the territory of Son of Dracula, which was following up the Lugosi movie. But it's a similar setup to Taste the Blood of Dracula, where we have people that are basically just seeking a thrill. Like, they're out to party, and the cops are going to break everything up, so they've got to go somewhere else, and Alucard has in mind of what they can do. They can go to a creepy-ass church and resurrect Dracula, why not? It's been 100 years, so. But that's also to show, like, when you see that it's kind of the same setup as Taste of Blood of Dracula, it almost kind of gives this vibe, this, like, knowing vibe of some things don't change with these people, even within a 100-year difference. So, naturally, the ritual takes place, and like I said, part of the fun is seeing how and when Dracula is going to be resurrected in the story. And we see the ritual performed by Alucard, and he, at some point in there, he appears to sing Let It Go, like 40 years before the song even happened. And I wouldn't make that joke, except for the fact that when he says Let It Go a couple times in a row, it's almost like even in the rhythm of the song. It's weird. But yes, eventually Dracula does come back, and this, of course, results in the death of one of the friends, Laura. And this is when the movie decides to take its more modern approach, and kind of do something with this franchise we haven't really seen before, involving the death of Laura. Because when it starts off and they're discussing her, obviously there's something very off-putting about Alucard to them, especially after seeing this ritual. To the point that Jessica, like, can't even look at him without being terrified when she, like, runs away and looks back and he's, like, still there. But then we get to the point where he comes back and he's like, oh yeah, we knew what Laura was doing. We knew where she was going. I just took her there. That's where she is now. She's just not here. That's it. And there's this one moment in particular that I've never been able to quite identify what tone it's going for. And it's when they're sitting around and they're discussing Laura, and they've kind of somewhat accepted. She's just somewhere else. But there's still a bit of suspicion, particularly on Jessica's part. And when they discuss something, they say something like, oh man, wait till Laura hears this. And there's just this abrupt cut to her dead in like a landfill. And it cuts right back to them. And I've never been able to quite tell if that's supposed to be like a jarring cut, to be like, oh, they think she's alive and they're imagining she's alive and well, and this is where she actually is. Or if it's intended to be darkly comedic. And I feel like there's that kind of editing, I feel like there's no way it's not just intended to be kind of a bit of dark comedy. Which, like I said, we got bits of comedy in the first movie that didn't really continue much throughout this, except with the occasional, like, slight appearance of dark humor here and there. But not really as prominently as we previously saw it. So it doesn't really feel like there's much of a break, so it does feel like we're getting in more of a self-aware territory, particularly by the idea of the time jump, where it's like, we get to the point where every franchise tends to have their jumping the shark moment. I'm going to assume this is considered to be this. Like, it's pretty late, to their credit, the idea, unless you count trying to do a reboot previously. But there is the angle that makes this different from everything else and kind of takes in the more modern approach, and that is the fact that now that there is an apparent death, once Laura's body is found, usually the movies just kind of go on, and the bodies will pile up, and, you know, coffins will pile up and all that. But now that we're in 1972, we get to have a formal investigation from inspectors and detectives and the like, which is sounds like a lot much more interesting inclusion into this franchise than it actually ends up being. Because we do bring Van Helsing into this investigation, which is great. We have Peter Cushing, who had, like, just lost his wife, like, right before they did this, so he's got, like, that really sort of long stare at times, when he's, like, clearly really contemplating something. And you get that sense of, like, real-life loss kind of coming through with him, but it also helps that it kind of comes from a place of somebody that's, like, seen a lot. Because also we don't know him as well as we knew the previous Van Helsing, because this is a new character to us. But we get the vibe knowing this family in general, I guess. The shit that he has maybe possibly seen investigating, like, the occult and stuff like that. But the thing is it starts off really lively, and it's got, like, really engaging characters, or engaging enough characters. I do like Christopher Nane's performance as Alucard. Where, like I said, even if he's sort of Malcolm McDowell-like, he does it well enough. So, and it adds a certain liveliness to what exactly the antagonism in this movie is. But it does get dull relatively quickly, even with the era change. Because it is one of those cases where, like, I don't feel like they take enough advantage of the time change, actually. It's almost like just kind of a background element now that we're just in present day. And not that I'm expecting, like Star Trek 4 or something, where, like to see Dracula walking around at night and getting into weird, modern sort of interactions. That's, like, I wouldn't be expecting that kind of thing. But I'd expect them to maybe put the time jump to a bit more use than they actually do, apart from just adding something a bit more modern, like the investigation angle. But, I don't know. But once again, this is another case where Lee wasn't a fan of the script at all, so he was basically trying to... it feels like he's barely here, which leaves Alucard as pretty much the main antagonist for most of it, until he's eventually taken care of, and then we have no choice but to make Dracula our final showdown. But the thing is it's like, he's here so little, it's almost like you can see Lee kind of, like, quietly trying to back out of the room, hoping nobody sees him leaving. But it's... yeah, so it can be kind of a letdown if you get really intrigued by what the premise is. But it is kind of a letdown in how dull it gets, despite how this seems like it should be such an interesting change to kind of shake things up in the franchise. But it really just kind of hits a wall once we hit the investigation angle, and it kind of gets redundant and all that. So that is kind of disappointing, but as I said, it does lead us pretty much right into the next movie. which is the Satanic Rites of Dracula. This is one that I actually saw in not the greatest shape the first time I saw it. It was those like skinny case DVDs you could find for like $1, where the quality on them is like equivalent to basically a VHS. And it's that's how I first saw this one. It might have been under another title, like Count Dracula and His Vampire Bride, I think, or something along those lines. And this one is still keeping us in that 70s setting. Alan Gibson is still here as the director, and which is actually kind of surprising. It almost seems like it's one of those things that they jump into the 1970s. You think they kind of back down and want to go back to the safer place to do this, which would be the period setting, but for this one, they kept going with that timeline, as we mentioned, and we have a couple of returning characters, like Jessica, who is now played by Joanna Lumley, and Inspector Murray, who is still played by Michael Coles, and to my understanding, he's the only person besides Lee and Cushing to actually come back and be playing the same character. We've seen some characters come back through different actors, and we saw one or two actors, I think, come back as different characters. Like The Undertaker in the first movie was in The Brides of Dracula, but as a different character. So this one pretty much puts us right back in that territory we were in the last one, where it's pretty much right in that area where I was talking about how it started to get dull, where you have this really campy idea of having this sort of modern investigation with modern cops on these murders that are being committed by rituals and or vampires or whatever. But it's pretty much, like I said, the quality of it's pretty much right where we left it. Very redundant and kind of weighing down the otherwise, like, kind of greatness of the campy idea. But now the stakes are a little higher because the people performing the rituals are dignitaries, one of which is Freddie Jones from, like, Dune and The Elephant Man and stuff like that, who is somebody that Van Helsing actually knows personally. So that's about as much, character work as we're going to get. Every other case, we'll pretty much introduce the characters just so they can be put in danger. Jane, I think, is the secretary's name. Who gets this whole sequence that's kind of built up to, but then we see it in full when she's taken. And this movie has some action-y qualities to it that are kind of interesting, I guess. Like motorcycle chases and stuff like that. It's a little weird. Not as weird later when they're getting pursued by snipers, but that's a whole other thing. But once she is taken, yeah, it does feel like this sort of low-budget action movie, and which leads to her being imprisoned in chains, and that's when I'm kind of come back to a bit of a classic feel when Jessica goes down and all the other, like, vampire women start to come out and start to attack her. But Jessica finds herself in some very absurd situations in this movie. There's this scene which, like I said, typically would feel like a classic scene, except for the fact that it's done in like that weird slow-mo / shaky cam thing, whatever's going on, made weirder by the fact that it cuts back to scenes that look normal just to cut back to this, and it's still like that. It's weird. And yes, she is also pursued by snipers, or one of the cops. And it's at this point during the sniper scene you start to ask yourself, this was a vampire movie, right? And it's like, I know we've pretty much already jumped the shark by jumping ahead 100 years into the 1970s, but it still feels like we kind of crossed a whole other line of absurd when we're watching a vampire movie, specifically a Dracula movie, and they're being shot at by snipers. It just, yeah. I mean, it does give you that whole vibe of, like, almost like an espionage film. I think that's what they're going for, but I don't know how well they accomplished it. But it's when you see the idea and you get a grasp on it, it's like, I see what this could have been, but it's actually kind of a mess. But on the other side of that, we do have some scenes that feel very old-fashioned horror, like going back to scenes that if they had happened in the previous movies, back when we were still in the period setting, they would have fit right in. Like when we see Dracula for the first time. Well, there's actually the moment before that where he's introduced by us not seeing him when we see the pictures of the dignitaries taken at this ritual, and there's one of them is just like a blank doorway with nobody there. And it's like, that is a kind of an interesting way to sort of, because like as soon as we see that, like the cops are kind of baffled, like, oh well, this must be a mistake or something. But it's like we as the audience know immediately what that means. So that's nice. But then there's the moment when he actually does appear for the first time after Jane has been taken, and it's like the fog starts to come in from under the door, and it's like the whole room like comes to life. And it's a really cool scene and a great way to introduce him, but that's not really the vibe that the movie always has. In fact, it's quite rare. But in the meantime, that humor that I've been looking for, that we saw some of in the first movie, does come back every now and then in just little bits. Like the one particular moment when the cops are going to the house, and the doors open by themselves, and the other cop just turns to Murray and says, well, you're the law, meaning you go first, by all means. And so stuff like that is kind of funny, and probably would have been a bit more welcome, but it still felt very few and far between, like most of the good elements of this one. Now, we do have to get to a point eventually where we really, really desperately need a Dracula Van Helsing confrontation, because it's weird how rare those are in this franchise. So we do get this whole side thing going on where Van Helsing gets the idea to track down this Denham dude who has built his business on top of where Dracula's remains once were. And obviously it's going to turn out that this Denham dude is in fact Dracula, just kind of sitting in the shadows. And there's this whole scene that's, I mean, it's great because based on the idea of Van Helsing having a full conversation with Dracula, but not knowing that it's him that he's talking to. There is something there, but at the same time, it's like, that bone structure is, like, unmistakable. And especially when this is your arch enemy over however many years. Well, obviously not this Van Helsing specifically, but I feel like this Van Helsing knows enough to recognize Dracula when he sees him. And because obviously we, the audience, will. But then he's got that, comically tiny gun with the silver bullet in it. And we do get a bit of a confrontation here, because it's obviously clear that Lee has more lines in this... Lee has more lines in this movie than he does in any other movies. He may have more lines in this scene than he has in the entire series as well. The same could be said about the climax also. But if you're kind of looking for those confrontations, they're still kind of a bit anticlimactic and abrupt, the way they usually are. We do have the moment where Van Helsing has been captured by Dracula, and Dracula says, no, don't kill him now. That would be too easy. Basically, Dracula turning into a Bond villain, which is very funny because this only came out the year right before Christopher Lee actually did play a Bond villain. So... but it is actually kind of a bit of an interesting fuck you plan, because at this point he does have Jessica, and he's going to do the ritual, and his plan is to make Van Helsing part of the ritual. So there is something nice and evil there, but the climax of the whole thing is, because this is going to be the last time we see Lee as Dracula, so we want the climax to be really, really kind of big between these two, and very, very finalized. Despite the fact that didn't stop them from still trying to get him to come back for that 9th one. But we do have, like I said, he has more lines in this scene alone than he probably does in the whole franchise. And there is something here in regards to the way they face off, but eventually it just ends up with Dracula stuck in a bush until he gets stabbed. But we do have the moment where, Van Helsing stands over his body triumphantly and, takes the ring, and we freeze frame on that. As if to say, now, for God's sake, you can't possibly come back. And much to Lee's happiness, I'm sure, that ended up being the case. So, I do think this is, probably, clearly, I would say probably the weakest entry, at least for me. But there's still some stuff here, and like I said, it definitely has a lot of ideas that could have been really cool. Kind of throw this into the mix of those movies that you hear about where, where people are suggesting that instead of remaking good and classic movies, remake bad movies that had really good ideas. I feel like you can actually do something with this idea, and a lot of the ideas in this one, but the execution is clearly not here. So, and this one is kind of like, even when I was younger, I always felt like this one was like easily the weakest, and not necessarily just because the copy that I owned was so shitty. I'm not even sure where that DVD is. It's got to be around here somewhere. But I put all those skinny case ones all in one place somewhere. But you can see how much they're worth to me. Let's go ahead and go into the final movie in this list, which is the Legend of the Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires. Now, we start in 1804, and we have a returning director with Roy Ward Baker, who brought us Scars of Dracula, and another director was brought in to kind of touch up the martial arts scene, or expand the martial arts scenes or something. But yeah, so we start in 1804, and we have a new Dracula now, who there's no need to resurrect him, because clearly we're in yet another timeline, because we're starting in 1804, and God knows where we are at this point. So, as far as continuity goes. So, it doesn't matter. We got a new Dracula anyway, so it doesn't matter. We have John Forbes Robertson, who looks the part, but to my understanding was super pissed off that his voice got dubbed. So, when you look at him, also, I imagine you can probably criticize it a little bit and say, like, it looks a bit too Halloween costume, and his makeup looks a little bit too, like, also Halloween costume, but I think that's also just a case of we're just so used to Lee and seeing him, and he's just got that really iconic look that is like one with the costume itself and the makeup and all that stuff, that anybody else just kind of looks like they're doing an imitation of sorts. So that was really, so it was kind of just lose-lose for him going into this. But I'm sure he's fine if we had seen maybe more of his stuff. But unfortunately, he's not even very present in this one, because now Dracula can take the form of people, which to my understanding was supposed to be, it's the same screenwriter, was supposed to be something he could do in the last one, the Satanic Rites of Dracula, but they cut it out. So they decided we'll just throw it into this one so he can do that now. So he is approached by this monk of sorts who says, you know, they're talking about the village of the vampires and all that, and Dracula's like, well, I'm kind of stuck in this castle because I'm cursed, so I'm going to need your body to get out of here and do all that shit. So that's just what he looks like until the very end, when he comes back into his final form, just to pretty much die immediately, as he does. So, this opening scene, though, is, like, pretty well shot. And, like the lighting is really well done, where it's kind of got that bluish-green look to it. And it's a really nice introduction. And then, much like this series likes to do, we're just going to go ahead and jump ahead 100 years. I don't know what it is with this franchise and jumping ahead 100 years, but we're going to do it again. But now we're in 1904. So still not exactly in modern-day times by any means. And we get this new, I keep wanting to say opening scene, but we're pretty far into it at this point, and even more so when this one scene is over, which is Van Helsing giving a lecture in this school, and we get a story that's going to be the background that kind of sets the scene for what the rest of the movie is going to be. And what I really like about this scene is how it's a whole story being relayed to us by Van Helsing, so it really kind of gives it this, like, it doesn't necessarily just feel like another vampire scene or whatever. It feels like it's a scene that has, like, or it's a story that has, like, some historic weight to it, as we're learning it, especially since we learned that the student, Ching, that's really into hearing this, is really into hearing it because it's connected directly to his family and his own village. And when we see the different vampires here, where we see, like, the golden masks and the makeup and stuff like that, it goes back to what I was talking about in, I think Dracula's Risen from the Grave, where I was talking about how the stuff that's cheesy now, is actually still, is that way for a reason, because it worked so well back then. And yeah, I can see the masks and the makeup looking really cheesy nowadays, but I don't know, I still think it's pretty creepy looking. And it could also be the case of we're so used to seeing rituals at this point, is another reason that it could probably come off not that strong. But I don't know. It's still, the whole thing still works for me and really does have this like creepy nightmarish vibe, especially the even creepier moment when we see all of the graves rising. It's like really sort of wicked imagery. Like I said, even if some of the stuff looks fake, once again, that's always going to be the charm. There are plenty of bats on strings in this to get us through wanting that camp factor. So it's all here. But then once they decide to go and battle these vampires, it kind of unexpectedly becomes more of like an expedition kind of movie. And it's basically about their journey on this, and we do meet some new characters here and there. There's, and characters that kind of connect with each other. Like, we have Van Helsing's son in the mix, who ends up, seemingly having this connection with Ching's sister in a way. And then there is Vanessa, the blonde, that kind of, her and Ching end up having a thing as well. That goes into some interesting emotional directions that we're not expecting. It just kind of feels like they're just saying, oh, here, we'll just pair these characters up, because what else are they going to do? But no, they actually kind of have a plan with that by the time we get to the climax, interestingly enough. But in the meantime, we're just going to have journeying, big fight martial arts scene, more journey, big fight martial arts scene, and so on. Now the question is if it's going to be that simple, which is kind of what we want out of this. When an idea is this absurd, the more simple the better. The more it just sticks to what that crazy thing is, the better. Because it's one of those things where you hear about, like I was talking about the absurdity and silliness of having snipers in a vampire movie, and it's like, how about martial arts? If you want to take that up a notch. And it's like, yeah, this is the kind of thing where you hear that and you immediately want something that's like super cheesy and super campy and over the top and all that. And that's what this movie is. Like, this movie completely keeps its promises. And it's exactly what you expect it to be. And it does it fairly well. Like, the fight scenes in between are, you know, relatively well choreographed, especially for the kind of movie we're talking about. We get to see that Van Helsing still has that fight in him that we always loved. There is that point in time where he seems to accidentally fall into a fire. But he, in this very smooth move, comes back up with a flaming stick and uses it as a weapon, as if that was totally what he meant to do the whole time. So we'll let him get away with it. But, yeah, and then that's just basically what the movie is. It's exactly what you expect it to be, until we get to the climax, when we're fighting all the vampires that the 7 that we're specifically talking about, one of which is the dreaded reincarnated one. And, yeah, it gets to a point where we get a really heavy scene where Vanessa is bitten and changes after Ching goes up to her for this really nice emotional moment, and she reveals her fangs in this genuinely shocking moment where she bites him. And what's even more shocking than that is the outcome when he realizes that he has to kill her, much to his dismay and heartbreak. So he kills her by impaling her, and then realizing he's also been bitten, why not make this a murder-suicide, and also impales himself. It's heavy. Like, unexpectedly heavy, which is appreciated. And, like I said, given that it's amongst all the chaos, it's not like the movie is taking a break from its campy nature to be emotional. It's just kind of all within there, and it hits in the right way, but then the movie just kind of keeps going in the way that you would more expect it to. And then, yes, eventually, finally, there is a final confrontation with Van Helsing and Dracula one more time. We have finally reached, we got Lee's last outing, now we're at Cushing's last outing as Van Helsing, I think. And, yeah, first off, obviously he's got to change back into his original form, which takes a while. Like, it feels like we're standing there for a long time with Van Helsing just waiting for this change to happen. Because it's like the dissolve in the scene that's doing the effect seems to just kind of pause for a while. And then it's like, oh, there, okay, I can kind of see him. It's like, okay, there he is in his full form, finally. And then all this build-up and all that waiting, and this fight is 2 slaps and 1 stab. That's it. So, 2 slaps from Dracula, 1 stab from Van Helsing, and the movie is over. So, so obviously this is completely out of place with the rest of the franchise, but at the same time, though, it's like, you're in a franchise that's this long, you're always going to have at least that one sequel that like stands out and is weird, and different from the others. But it's like, how off the rails, how crazy is this franchise when AD 1972 is now officially not that movie that made it go completely in a different direction? Because it certainly still remains that, but this one feels even more different than that one, and not just because we no longer have Christopher Lee playing the part, because once again, Dracula's barely here. This may have been another one of those cases where that Dracula may not have originally even been supposed to be here, or they were gonna like cut him down and like release, when they do that thing where they release different cuts of it. One of them was supposed to just have Dracula cut out of it entirely, and yeah, what would that change? Because it kind of just seems like that final vampire that falls into the pit thing at the end, right before Dracula reveals himself, could have easily just been the main antagonist. So yeah, it's strange when you go into this that you don't expect how many of the Dracula franchise Dracula was kind of shoehorned into, and is barely here for. But yeah, there's this. So I really don't mind this one, and I do think it's better than the Satanic Rites of Dracula, which I still think is the worst one. But the thing is there are a couple of quotes from a couple of the filmmakers, and there's one that might be maybe a bit too harsh, but it's still kind of funny to hear it from the source. And the other is more of what I'm thinking. One of them is Rory Ward Baker himself, the director, apparently said the whole setup was slipshod and nobody knew what anyone was doing, and the film was a failure, an absolute failure. It seems a little bit harsh coming from the dude that made it, but the executive, who's like also a producer and director, he is the son of one of the co-founders of Hammer, said it wasn't such a good idea, but some of the film is quite good. I think that's much closer to yeah, because like it's kind of the reverse of the Satanic Rites of Dracula, which was a lot of really good ideas poorly executed, and it's like this is a well executed bad idea. So that's pretty much, I think that pretty much takes us to the end of this franchise. These were the 9 Hammer Dracula movies, and they're a lot of fun to go through, and some of them are genuinely good. Most of them are, you know, genuinely good on a production standpoint, obviously, because Hammer did that like nobody else, particularly in this era. So I don't know what else I can say about these, so I think that's where I'm going to end this, and where we can finally end the videos that we're due in October. So now we can go through the whole string of November that's just going to happen in really quick rapid succession and kind of come out all at the same time, and then we'll be in December really quickly. So until all of that, I think that's it for